Recording. Awesome, and we're live. Good morning, everybody. So we've got a good session this morning on managing a safe return to a COVID secure workplace. Just in the green room launching the webinar today, we were talking about the fact that the world is such a changeable place right now, and I don't think anything could be a better metaphor than the English weather. We can go from a summer's Monday to a snowing Monday a week later, apparently, if you believe in weather forecasts. Today on the call, we've got Nikki, we've got Rebecca, and we've got Claire, who are going to discuss all of these topics. But obviously, if anybody's got any questions, please put them into the chat. And also, if anybody would like any more information that isn't covered today, please also bubble that up in the chat towards the end of the session so that we can make sure that we follow up on those points in a future session. With that, I'm going to hand over to yourself, if that's okay, Nikki.
Yeah, no, smashing, excellent. Thank you ever so much, Holly. And thank you very much for everyone for attending. It's good to see lots of familiar and new faces. So thank you all very, very much. Just to introduce, so we've got today speaking, there's myself, Nicola Cockerill. I'm an employment lawyer at Buckles. We've also got Rebecca Ryan of Leeds Day, who's an employment specialist as well. And we've got Claire Berry from Price Bailey, who is also an employment lawyer as well. So today we're going to be talking, it seems rather fitting as businesses are starting to look at returning to the workplace. We decided to focus our session on managing that return to a COVID secure workplace. I will just emphasise that we are focusing this session on actually returning into the office workplace itself, because obviously when we talk about workplaces these days, having worked remotely, as I guess most of us are, looking at people there, certainly I am at the moment. Obviously it could also include the home environment, but we are talking about the office space itself. So I think, if you don't mind, I'd just like to start off running a couple of polls, if everybody would not mind taking part. So Ollie, are you able just to pop up the first poll question, please?
Yeah, of course.
Excellent. So I'm just interested, or rather we're just interested to know, just to try and sort of gauge where people are at the moment. So do you anticipate, or have you guys experienced any change in working patterns due to COVID? So this might be over the last few months, it might have been over the last 12 months. If people just want to answer yes or no, I will just say this is completely anonymous, so we're not going to know who's answered what. But if people are able just to answer yes or no, that would be great. I appreciate it's quite a wide question. So do you anticipate, or have you experienced any change in work patterns? Don't know.
Got 34 of 43 responses, so that's about 80% of people on the call.
Okie dokie. Shall we?
I think that's a fairly overwhelming answer, isn't it?
I haven't got any answers showing in front of me, Ollie. Have
you not? Okay, I shall end the poll. Can you all see that now?
Can anybody see it? Yes. Oh, wow. Okay, fantastic. Excellent. Okay.
Not a lot of grey area, Nikki.
Not a lot of grey area. Wow, that's pretty unusual from a legal point of view. Okay, thank you, everybody. Can I just ask one more question? Again, it's just interesting to see where everybody's at, and because all businesses are actually at different stages. So second poll, if you can just open that, Ollie, please. So what changes have you, or do you anticipate in working patterns? So we've given a number of answers there. Please tick as many that are relevant to you. So have you, or are you intending there to be any changes with location of work, hours, pay, job role? It's quite generic. Reducing staffing levels, or something other?
Yeah, it's only, the question's only allowing single answers, Nikki. So I guess it's the most relevant to them.
Right. Okay, yeah, well, the most relevant then, I'm afraid.
Again, that's looking fairly comprehensive. We're up to almost 80% again. So
brilliant. Do you want to close that then, Ollie, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you ever so much. So, okay, so yes, that's quite interesting. So let me just note that. Okay, that's, yeah. So majority percent is actually location. I do take, somebody's just commented to say that with other, there isn't an option to add detail. And I do accept that. And it would have been nice to be able to. And I'm sorry that we weren't able to ask that in the poll. But no, that's fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Right, so let's just move on then. So I'm going to start off by talking about returning to the workplace in terms of travel. So a number of issues that my clients have been dealing with is actually people being concerned about travelling into and from the workplace. There's obviously another issue of actually work travel itself, but I'll come on to that in a second. So I think it's useful just to remind ourselves as to what the current position is in respect to the government announcement back in January. So the current position remains, I'm just going to quote it, I'm sure everybody knows this now, I'm sure that it's ingrained into us, but anyway, individuals should only attend the workplace when they cannot reasonably work from home. Employers should take every possible step to facilitate their employees working from home, including providing suitable IT and equipment to enable remote working. So that is still very much the government position, the government guidance. Now this is envisaged to remain in place until step 4 of the government's roadmap, which, as I'm sure everybody's aware of, is not expected to come into place any earlier than the 21st of June. It's not obviously set in stone, but that's the intended date. Now, obviously, there have been a number of industries where people haven't been able to home work, construction, manufacturing, childcare being the most obvious ones. And of course, where you can't work from home, then you are permitted to go into the workplace. Now, as I say, my clients are experiencing, when they're having conversations now about returning into workplace, they're experiencing concerns of their employees, reluctance, hesitance to be coming back into the workplace. Now, what do you do when somebody doesn't want to come back into the workplace? Well, my advice would be to be exploring with them individually what their concerns are. So what are they concerned about? Why is it that they don't want to come into the workplace? Is it concerned, if it's concerns with travel, then you know, what are those concerns? Maybe that your employee has an underlying health condition that you're not actually aware of. Maybe they live with somebody with an underlying health condition, they have caring responsibilities, perhaps they have a child with, excuse me, with a disability. Everybody's individual circumstances are individual to themselves. Explore with them if there's any ways of resolving their concerns or their issues. You know, try to alleviate their concerns as much as possible. I think it's also worth just going back to, you know, is it necessary for them to travel into the workplace? Can the role actually be undertaken from home? Can all of the role be undertaken, or can part of the role be undertaken from home? Can you change their hours? So perhaps the concern is actually using public transport. Well, in which case, can you look at them starting earlier or starting later? Therefore finishing earlier, finishing later. You know, changing their hours of work to be outside of peak times. Would that be of any assistance? Can you offer them parking outside the office, particularly if you haven't got a full office? Can you offer them any parking outside, or somewhere nearer to the office if they have to, you know, travel all the way across the city? Can you adjust their role temporarily? So can you consider parts that can be worked from home, then continuing to work those, and the parts that need to be in the workplace, and is there somebody else that could temporarily and willingly undertake that part of the role? You might want to consider flexible working. That may be necessary, depends on the individual circumstances. Furlough, again, or indeed take a holiday or unpaid leave. So there's lots of options that you really ought to be considering and speaking to your staff about. Finally, I'm just going to very, very quickly touch on travel for work purposes. Now, this isn't something that has come up much, surprisingly, but it's something that I do anticipate in the future becoming a bit more of an issue, a bit more of a concern as places, you know, as businesses are trying to go back to some form of normality. So it may not be appropriate, it may not be feasible to require someone to travel for work purposes. Again, government guidance, it needs to be necessary. Work travel is wherever the person's required to go, is that necessary? Could it be carried out virtually? So we, for example, are now having a virtual webinar. No, it's not the same as being face-to-face, but it does a similar purpose. Are there any protective measures that could be imposed? And you need to be obviously ensuring that any protective equipment is sourced. So it depends on what that work purpose is. Are we talking about a corporate lunch? Are we talking about business development? Are we talking about a webinar? It depends what we're talking about. We obviously need to give consideration to the individual circumstances. Is it someone that's clinically vulnerable, pregnant, over 70s? So somebody that's at high risk of contracting COVID, or developing a serious illness. So there's an awful lot that does need to be considered and thought about. It does need to be considered on an individual basis, not a collective one-size-fits-all approach. As you can appreciate, there is a theme that's probably going to come out of this webinar, and that is about communication. Communication is absolutely key. Communication internally and communication with your staff. If you communicate, you're going to find out a lot earlier what those issues are and actually whether those issues can be addressed in a way that suits everybody. Now I'm just going to pass over to Claire, who's going to talk about returning into the workplace in a little bit more detail. So just pass over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Nikki. Yes, when considering a return to the workplace, the government guidance is that you have to consult individuals about their return due to it being on a health and safety basis. The guidance encourages employers to have individual conversations with their workers where this is reasonable, to consider their work plans and to discuss any uncertainty the individuals may have about precautions that are being put in place to make a COVID secure workplace. It's important that you do double check to see whether you already have any agreements in place with trade unions or employee representatives, as in if you have to follow any formal consultation process. It is good practice to do this because it will flush out any issues early on that any individuals might have. So it might not be an issue later on the line if something you introduce comes that they didn't really expect. So when you are consulting, what you need to look at is what the workplace is going to look like in the future, including travel plans, and you should also share your risk assessments. So you would need to discuss with them if there's any planned adjustments to the workplace for example, any additional hand sanitizer facilities, whether you intend to stagger the start and finish time so that you avoid having overcrowding at a particular time, whether you're going to have markings on the floor and a one-way system, or whether you're going to have workplace bubbles effectively. So it is best practice that you start having these discussions before people come back to the workplace so that they feel involved in the process, rather than saying this is what we're going to do and you've already made that final decision. You can also consider whether to put in place a COVID-19 policy or procedure covering relevant issues for an organisation, which you can update as and when guidance changes. So I think the key, as Nikki's already said, is about communication, and the earlier you start that, the more buy-in you're going to get from your employees. They're going to understand what procedures you're going to put in place, and they'll feel secure at returning to the workplace. Okay, we're just going to move on to Becky, who's just going to have a discussion with us about any issues that you need to consider relating to those that might have disabilities or those who are anxious about returning to the workplace.
Thanks, Claire. Yes, so I'm going to talk about the discrete area of disability as employment law continues and applies irrespective of COVID. So obviously we've got the Equality Act that affords protection for those with disabilities. Disability, just to recap, is a physical or mental impairment that could have a long-term impact on somebody's ability to carry out their day-to-day duties. Offering protection to those in relation to discrimination. The area I'm thinking could be relevant here is indirect discrimination, which is where you can apply the same practice to everybody or the same policies to everybody, i.e. you've got to come back to work, but it can disproportionately affect those with a disability. So it's looking at, you don't want to be indirectly discriminating against people with those with disabilities with the policies that you may be looking to introduce about coming back. Also, particularly in relation to disability discrimination, you've also got the responsibility as an employer to make reasonable adjustments for those with a disability. So going that extra mile to see whether there's anything that you need to do to make their return to work more comfortable or anything else. There's the responsibility to make reasonable adjustments. I think it's important, it's physical and mental disability. Now, one of the things that I've certainly coming out, I'm seeing a lot of, is that people who have perhaps had anxiety in the past, the last year has really impacted on quite a lot of people's mental health. So it's being conscious of, now, while they may have suffered, it may not be sufficient to amount to a disability, but I think it's also always important to consider that something, if it has a long-term impact, could have a long-term impact, and rule of thumb for that is about a year, but a long-term impact on their ability to carry out day-to-day duties, then they could well have protection under the Equality Act. So looking at those reasonable adjustments, making sure that the policies that you put in place don't indirectly discriminate people who may have a disability. Again, communicating with your staff, see if their circumstances have changed over the last year. Anxiety, mental health problems certainly could be, but also physical. Long COVID is, as we're seeing, quite a reality. And so, has their physical situations changed? So is it possible that somebody may be potentially disabled and they weren't before? The other thing that's worth thinking about is you can't discriminate somebody who's associated with somebody with a disability. So if they're living with somebody who may have a disability, you can't indirectly discriminate against them either. The responsibility to make reasonable adjustments doesn't extend to somebody who's associated with somebody with a disability, but again, that's perhaps all part of your well-being and care. Talk to staff, think about whether for those with a disability or may be protected, that you are being more flexible. Perhaps you're looking at more flexibility, perhaps working from home for longer, perhaps furlough, perhaps unpaid leave or something like that. It may take them longer, or they may need more adjustments in order to be able to come back to work, if at all. Look at as well, there's a scheme called the Access to Work scheme that does offer support for disabilities. That's worth looking at as well. I'm going to say it again, it's care towards talking to your staff, understanding what their specific needs are, but just being mindful of your obligations and responsibilities in relation to those who may have a disability. That's all I'm going to say for that at the moment. Passing over to Nikki, who's going to look at some health and safety aspects for us.
Brilliant, thanks ever so much, Becky. Just trying to find my unmute button there before I do what lots of other people have done before me, speak whilst muted. I do, a lot of people would probably appreciate that. Moving on to health and safety concerns. So again, actually touching on what Becky and Claire have just said, health and safety has always been around. It's not new legislation in itself. It's just that employees facing health and safety concerns has, my experience anyway, increased over the last 12 months. I am seeing, I have several tribunal claims now, put it that way, with whistleblowing allegations attached. So there is a marked increase. So with health and safety concerns, how does an employer, how do you as an employer deal with an employee's concerns about health and safety in the workplace? What do you do if you are accused about breaching government working guidelines? Are you liable if an employee contracts COVID in the workplace? What processes do you need to have in place? So there's a whole multitude of questions that are associated with health and safety, and quite frankly, we could sit here all day talking about it. But in essence, as I said, there are duties and obligations. An employer has a statutory duty under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, probably all aware of that, to ensure the health, safety and welfare of its employees as far as reasonably practicable. Employers also have a common law duty to take reasonable care for the safety of their employees and to provide them with a safe place of work and a safe system of working. And there is an implied term in the contract of employment that employers will take reasonable care for the health and safety of their employees. So all of these are principles that have been around for many, many years. As you're probably all familiar with, where an employee raises health and safety concerns, they are afforded protection under legislation against being dismissed or being subjected to a detriment. Again, you may or may not be aware that you don't need any qualifying length of service. So for an unfair dismissal claim, for example, you usually need 2 years length of service. But where an employee raises issues regarding health and safety, then they don't need to have any length of service. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail regarding dismissals and detriments, because, as I say, it's a very, very complex area of law anyway. And we really could have half a day session on this. But just to obviously be aware, and as I say, these issues are very much on the rise at the moment. So if you do receive concern from an employee, what should you do with it? Well, obviously, my advice would be not to ignore it, which may seem silly, but I do know instances where concerns aren't actually addressed. You need to deal with the concern, and you really should deal with it promptly. You know, deal with it impartially. Don't be immediately, we've done everything that we possibly can. You know, look at what the concern is, consider it, have a conversation with the employee. That might be appropriate to understand the concern in a little bit more detail. Explore what can be done. You know, if you have done everything that you possibly can to comply with legislation, guidance, requirements, etc., then there may be nothing that you can do, but you still need to be addressing and dealing with their concern. If you've got a whistleblowing policy, then, as I say, potentially it's a whistleblowing complaint, so you may do well to follow your own policies and procedures in that respect. You do need to be really careful that even once you've dealt with a complaint and supposed that there's no ground and you can't do anything further to be improving your systems, you do need to be careful that you don't inadvertently subsequently subject that individual to a detriment, because of course that can be connected to the fact that they have raised a health and safety concern. Then, as I say, you're going to be looking at a potential claim against you. So it is advisable that if you do get such issues and concerns, that you actually make contact with somebody, perhaps a lawyer or someone that can assist you with it, particularly if you're not sure what you're doing with it. So basically, if you receive a concern, deal with it in a fair manner, deal with it promptly, deal with it impartially. Can you be liable if somebody contracts COVID in the workplace? Well, actually, potentially, yes, it could be. Again, it's going to depend on the individual circumstances, but if you fail to comply with any health and safety requirements, you fail to follow government guidance, you've indeed even failed to comply with your own policies and procedures, which frequently I come across employers that have done so, then actually, potentially, yes, you could be liable. That is going to depend on the individual circumstances. I think if an employer has done everything they possibly can, then I think that dramatically lowers that risk. As you're probably aware, the Health and Safety Executive can take enforcement action against employers. That can include fines and it can include criminal sanctions. There is no right under health and safety legislation, however, to claim for the employee to claim against the employer. This would need to be a personal injury claim. I'm not a personal injury lawyer, so obviously I can't advise on that. But again, given that there's possible long-term COVID, I'm not quite sure what long-term COVID exactly entails, because everybody's symptoms seem to be very different. It can be headaches, it can be tiredness. We don't know how long any of this is going to be lasting for, so as Becky's already said, talking about disability discrimination. But there would also be evidential issues, of course, showing that you contracted COVID in the workplace, but nonetheless, potentially, there could be a risk of claim by an employee, and as I said, there could be a risk of the Health and Safety Executive also coming after you if you haven't complied. It is going to be, however, very much on a case-by-case basis, as is always the case. That is a very much whistle-stop tour through health and safety. As I say, it's an enormous area. If anybody's got any particular questions or queries which they want to ask, then obviously please do get in contact with any of the three of us. I'm now just going to pass back to Claire, who's going to be talking about a really interesting area. I think it's really interesting, and I'm starting again to get lots of questions on it. This is regarding vaccinations. So over to you, Claire.
Yeah, the vaccinations is a interesting topic, and I think it's something that's going to continue to change as more and more people actually are given the vaccine. But just before I go into more detail, Ollie, could you put up the last poll, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So hopefully, there we go. That's now live.
So do you anticipate any questions or issues arising from staff with regards to vaccinations?
Excellent, we're at 60-odd%. 37 out of 49. A couple more and we'll close it down. Awesome, okay, stopped, right, perfect. It's a little trickier one for you to deal with here, Claire. Everything else has been fairly cut and dry, but
I think that's interesting that, yeah, there is such a variance between whether there are going to be any questions arising from it, and it probably depends on the area of the business or, yeah, the type of business you are. And as Nikki said, I think that will affect how everybody deals with the vaccinations. So one of the issues we want to look at is what do you do if someone refuses to have the vaccine altogether? Because there will be employees who are unable or unwilling to have the vaccine for a range of reasons. This could be either for medical conditions which prevent them from being vaccinated, or it might be because of their religious reasons or philosophical beliefs, or they may just have concerns generally about the safety and effectiveness of the vaccination. But if employees do not have a valid reason for having the vaccine, an employer could argue that a request to be vaccinated amounts to a reasonable management instruction on the basis that the instruction is intended to protect health and safety. Failure to follow an employer's reasonable instructions could lead to a disciplinary process and dismissal. But I'm not going to go into too much detail yet, as that's something Becky's going to consider shortly. But whether a requirement to be vaccinated is a reasonable management instruction does depend on the facts of the case. For example, the nature of the role and also the number of clinically vulnerable colleagues in the workplace. So, for example, in the healthcare sector, it may be reasonable to request employees to be vaccinated because they come into contact with vulnerable patients. However, in other sectors where you can actually work from home effectively, it may be that the instruction to have a vaccine is not considered reasonable. Unfortunately, there is no case or no one answer that fits all, and it's something that you'd have to consider in the circumstances of the employer. Another issue we've come across is what if somebody has had both of the vaccinations? Can you instruct them to come back into the workplace? Now, the answer is potentially yes. Some employers with workforces who can work from home are considering going or opening up the offices to a phased return for those that have been vaccinated. Now, it is currently unclear whether that will be in line with government guidance, which at the moment does say that anyone that can work from home should do so. But if an employer does mandate that a return to the office for vaccinated employees, it could cause some issues and with those that are unwilling to come back. And you need to take particular care with anyone that has disabilities, from whom remaining at home and working may be considered a reasonable adjustment. So I think it's a matter of looking at all the options and what you have in place and what the requirements of the business are as to whether you can request people back. The final issue that we're going to consider today is what if somebody has none of the vaccinations? Can you require them to come back into the workplace? At this time, it would not be practical for most employers to prevent unvaccinated employees back on the basis that the majority of the population haven't had their vaccine as yet. But we do expect that this will obviously change by the end of the year, and the guidance therefore will change by the end of the year. Careful consideration needs to be given before deciding whether it would be appropriate to prevent unvaccinated employees from returning to the workplace. The current guidance advises that it's clear that the vaccination state of the workforce has no impact on having a COVID secure workplace. You must follow the COVID or have a secure workplace from a COVID perspective, irrespective of whether anyone else has had the vaccine, and that will continue for some time. There are also data protection implications with the vaccine and asking whether or not you can have the vaccine and things like that. So Nikki, I'll hand over to you to discuss in more detail.
There we go. Thanks ever so much, Claire. Thank you. So, yeah, if we just have a quick look, obviously there's a whole load of issues with vaccinations. There's questions that have already been asked, there's questions that's going to arise in the future. There's it may be an issue for some people, it may not be an issue for others. My experience says there's been quite an uptake on vaccinations. I guess really we're early doors with it all, really, aren't we? There's only a portion of society that's actually been offered it. So yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting area, and my goodness me, does it throw up an awful lot of legal issues, doesn't it? So yes, touching on the vaccinations, therefore, comes the good old issue of data protection, which we all normally end up moaning and groaning a little bit about, don't we? So you know, at the end of the day, data protection is still relevant as well, and we do need to obviously bear in mind. So can we as employers collect data? And I'm not sure if that might be one of the questions in the chat, but anyway, can an employer collect data about whether an employee has been vaccinated? Can we do that? Can we tell employees who has and hasn't been vaccinated? Again, we're getting questions along those lines. Can an employer tell employees if someone has been diagnosed with COVID? That one might have been and gone, because I suspect, well, we've had COVID for the last 12 months, haven't we? I say we, I mean, obviously, you know, with you know, amongst our staff potentially. So that's been an ongoing issue. So I'll be interested what people have done with that. And then obviously, is there any data protection issues that we need to consider surrounding this collection and distribution of this data? Now, there is also another factor that I'm just going to very, very quickly touch on, because we don't really know what's going to happen with this. But the government have, of course, announced that they're going to carry out a review into whether COVID status certification could play a role in reopening the economy, and whether that's something which they may consider. So far, they don't have any plans to introduce a certificate, but they are conducting a review into it. Obviously, they would need to consider the ethical issues, discriminatory issues, privacy issues, legal and operational issues. There's a whole load of issues which have to be considered. So far, we as a society have been pretty resistant to this sort of, it's a bit like an identification model almost, isn't it? But anyway, we don't have an answer yet as to whether that's something which the government, you know, are going to bring in or not. It is something just to have in mind, because if that is brought in, then it may change things a little bit, because if there's a legal requirement to have this information, then that will also have a bearing on your business. So the current position is that we don't. So when we're considering employees' health information, which is exactly what this is, so it's vaccinations, illnesses, you know, sick leave, all sorts of things. It falls into the category of special category personal data. Now, I'm going to try not to go into data protection legislation in too much detail, because it's pretty dull, actually, let's be honest, and it's an absolute minefield. So to just try to keep it simple, obviously any health information falls into that special category personal data category. Employer must identify, if it falls into that category, an employer must identify two things: a lawful basis for processing the data and a condition for processing the data. Now, the lawful basis, there's a whole load of different bases. I think in reality, it would probably fall into the legitimate interests basis. And there's a three-stage process that you'd have to consider. Very, very briefly, it's identifying the legitimate interest, showing processing is necessary to achieve it, and then balancing it against the individual's rights, freedoms and interests. And then the ground for processing, there's again about 10 different grounds, but probably the relevant ones here would be performance of rights and obligations in connection with the employment, because of course we are talking about employment, that is reasoning for gathering this information, and there may also be health purpose arguments as well, but that is going to depend on the individual business. So can you collect data about vaccinations? Employers are advised, the ICO, and the ICO have some very, very useful guidance in respect to this. So I would recommend, if you haven't done so already, if this is an issue, have a look at the ICO website. Employers are advised that if they want to record, or if they need to record, need to give information about employees' vaccination status, there must be a clear and compelling argument for doing so, not just in case we need it. You have to have justifiable reasons for doing so. As I say, that's going to depend on the nature of your business, type of work which is undertaken, possibly. There could be situations within a business where there might be a justifiable need for a particular part of the business to obtain this information, and perhaps not other parts. It's going to depend. You must comply, obviously, with the legislation, so you need to be considering the test above, as I've just said, and that's a very, very quick whiz through. There is much more to be considering. Again, how long are you going to be obtaining the information for as well? So the ICO guidance is that you should review it regularly in light of the latest government guidance, which luckily isn't on a daily basis as it once was, and on scientific advice as well. Reality is, at the moment, we don't know with the vaccinations as to whether you have to have a vaccination every year, whether it's going to be something which you vaccinate, I don't know, every 10 years. We just simply don't know that information at the moment. I don't even know whether it's going to depend on which vaccination that you've had. So you need to be considering retention periods, which may or may not be the same for, as I say, depending on the vaccination that people have had. Where use of this type of data, so i.e. whether someone's been vaccinated or not, where that is going to potentially have a high risk to individuals, so I think Becky's going to be coming on to it shortly, but perhaps it's going to be denying somebody employment, then it is advised that you conduct a data protection impact assessment as well. Again, you're going to have to look at your policies and procedures, look at your privacy notices, your data protection policies. They may very well need to be updated to include this information if you're planning on gathering data about the vaccination. I think one of the questions might have been, can an employer inform colleagues if somebody's been vaccinated or not? Again, the ICO guidance is that employers should respect the duty of confidentiality to employees and shouldn't routinely be disclosing who's vaccinated and who hasn't, unless if there's a compelling reason for doing so. So again, it's going to be an individual basis, may be different within an organisation as well, depending on the different teams and what people are actually doing. What you could do, though, is just advise if it's a case of, because you want to notify, I don't know, customers or suppliers or something, you could advise that not all employees have been vaccinated and leave it at that. But you certainly shouldn't be saying that Bob and Sally haven't been vaccinated. Can you tell employees if someone's been diagnosed with COVID? Well, I'll be interested as to what people have been doing so far, actually, because I know many organisations that have been telling staff, oh, Bob's got COVID if you've been in close proximity with him. Again, though, the ICO guidance is that the employer shouldn't be disclosing that a colleague has contracted COVID. Unless if it's necessary to be doing so. You can be advising that somebody within this team or somebody within this bubble or somebody within this rota or shift or whatever has contracted COVID, but you shouldn't actually be naming the individual themselves. As I say, the ICO have some really useful guidance on this, so if this is an issue, then that might be a good port of call. I say I would be interested at the end on that point as to whether people have been advising that a particular person has had COVID, or whether it's been a bit more genuine. I think on that note, I'm just going to pass across to Becky, and Becky is now going to be talking to us, I think, a little bit more detail about contracts. I think over to you, Becky.
Nikki. Yes, I've got a thorny issue. It has raised its head in the press a bit. Can you have a contractual term that somebody has to be vaccinated? There was a recent study actually by the Chartered Management Institute who 58% of those that they questioned actually wanted to make vaccinations compulsory. I think it's an issue at the moment when not everybody has the opportunity. It's outside somebody's control. But what I'm going to do is break it down into those for existing employees and then future employees, because there's an argument that on the face of it, it's different, but you'll see it probably really isn't. So existing employees, you can only make a change to somebody's terms and conditions of employment, including that they have to have a vaccine if you get their agreement to do so. There are practical ways around that that can reduce your risk, but essentially changing terms and conditions, you need the consent of the other party to do so. That's one thing. Is it a reasonable management instruction to request that somebody has a COVID vaccine? So taking it slightly outside the terms and conditions, yes, possibly it is, but I think Claire alluded to this point. It will depend on the job. If you're working in a, in a healthcare environment or something like that, and there is the opportunity for them to have the vaccine, then yes, possibly it is a reasonable management instruction. But if you're working in an office, possibly not. So that certainly needs to be looked on its facts, whether that management instruction that you have to have a vaccine is sufficient will depend on the reasonableness for those particular people.
Probably not, because Auntie Amy's at work, darling.
Oh, I think somebody's not muted, but hopefully you can still hear me. And so looking at, so that's for existing employees, doing it for existing employees. For future employees, can you introduce a term whereby they have to have a new have a COVID vaccine? Yes, on the face of it, you can. But it will depend. You do have to be very careful about discrimination. So you've got to look at things like age discrimination. At the moment, obviously more mature people are being invited. Some younger people, they're not going to be having the vaccine. So you've got to look at age discrimination, disability discrimination, again, that we've already talked about, maternity, people are pregnant not being able to have the vaccine, religious beliefs, and all sorts of things. So there are lots of reasons as to why people might not have the vaccine. So by introducing this rule that you have to have the vaccine or requirement, you could be indirectly discriminating against certain people. Can you dismiss somebody if they don't have the vaccine? I think that would be a very risky, putting aside disability. It's not a fair reason of itself to have a vaccine. Could it possibly come within the fair reason of a disciplinary? Well, maybe, possibly, depending on the nature of the job or the reason for their refusal. Could it possibly be a capability thing? They can't do their job because in order to do their job, they have to prove they've been vaccinated because of perhaps a high healthcare risk or something. It could possibly come within the some other substantial reason, which is a catch-all in the future. I think it's too early to say that you could safely discipline somebody or dismiss somebody for not having had the vaccine. As an upshot, where we are at the moment, what I would say is that making it a contractual entitlement is a stretch. I think you'd be looking at encouragement rather than contractual entitlements at this stage. That's where I'm going to come down to. And I think disciplining or dismissing for not having had the vaccine does need to be looked at very carefully, both in respect of unfair dismissal, but also potential discrimination angles. Claire, I think, is going to pick up a little bit more on discrimination, actually, particularly in relation to this point. So I'm going to pass over to Claire.
Thanks, Becky. Yeah, requirement for employees or job applicants to be vaccinated, as I think Becky mentioned before, is likely to amount to either a provision, a criterion, or practice that puts individuals with a protected characteristic at particular disadvantage compared to others who do not share that protected characteristic. Therefore, a vaccination requirement could put employees of a particular age group or with those with a disability or pregnancy or maternity or sex or religious belief at a particular disadvantage. So we're just going to look briefly at each one. But at the moment, in terms of age, older individuals are currently being prioritised for the vaccination by the government. Employees not in that group potentially could have a discrimination claim if you did say that everybody now had to have the vaccination. Obviously, that will change over time. Disability. So some vaccines are not suitable for certain individuals, particularly those with suppressed immune systems. And employees with certain allergies are also advised not to have the vaccination. And other individuals may refuse a vaccine due to mental health issues or due to a phobia of needles. So potentially, depending on the circumstances, there is indirect disability discrimination claim there, depending on the circumstances. Looking at pregnancy and maternity, the current guidance is that those who are pregnant or are breastfeeding should not have the vaccine. Indirect discrimination does not apply specifically to pregnancy and maternity. However, indirect sex discrimination claim could be brought where a woman is disadvantaged by her employer due to a vaccination policy, which is linked to her pregnancy or maternity. So again, you just need to be very careful there of having a blanket vaccination policy. In terms of sex discrimination, so women may want to delay their vaccine if they're trying to conceive. There was a survey in December of 55,000 people, and they found that it is likely that 18 to 34-year-olds are likely to refuse a vaccine, citing worries about fertility. And then the other area is religion or belief. So it is possible that certain religions or could say that, you know, from their religious or philosophical belief, they will not have the vaccine. I understand that there is a concern that there may be gelatine in some of the vaccines, which is why some people for particular religious background won't have a vaccine. Although I understand that for the COVID vaccine, that doesn't apply, but there are concerns out there. And there's also other concerns that people may reject the vaccine because of the use of embryonic tissue in the testing and development of the vaccine. So there are other issues to take into account or to understand why people won't necessarily want the vaccine. And there's other groups of employees who may have a belief that the vaccine is actually harmful to health. Now, it's unlikely that this is going to amount to protected characteristic, but there is no specific case law at the moment. So any mandatory vaccine requirement would need to be justifiable as a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. So you've got to have reasons behind it, not just saying that everybody must have the vaccine. And even where an employer doesn't mandate, you must have the vaccine, you must ensure, as Becky has said previously, that your policies and procedures in the workplace don't indirectly discriminate against employees who are not vaccinated. I think that covers everything we're going to talk about in relation to the vaccine. I think it's an ongoing area where we're going to get advice as matters progress, and we may see some claims as well in the tribunal, which will help to know which way the tribunal would go in relation to these matters. So moving completely away from vaccines, we're now going to look at other queries that the three of us felt you might need some guidance on in relation to holidays and sickness. So I'll pass over to Becky.
Thanks, Claire. Holidays, they seem within a distant memory, don't they? Just as an aside, you probably all know the government changed the rules, and you can now carry holiday over if you were prevented from taking it due to COVID for the next 2 years. Some of you may or may not have already put in place policies in order to do that for people to carry their holiday over. What I would say about that is what you need to make sure is that holiday doesn't back up. So putting in place processes, how you would manage that so you don't end up with people backlogging a lot of holiday. And you can require people to take holiday at certain times, providing you give sufficient notice and stuff like that. But holidays, currently foreign holidays are illegal until the 1st of July. And UK holidays, you can go on a UK holiday from the 12th of April. So it's not something that's happening imminently, but I'm thinking people are probably booking holidays. So it's thinking about what are you going to do about it? How may this or may it not impact on the working environment? Is it a reasonable management request to say somebody can't go on holiday? No, I don't think it would be a reasonable management request to say that they can't go on holiday. And you've got to look at human rights issues and all sorts of stuff about that. Holidays are a health and safety, they're well-being, you know, they're an important part of people's ability to take rest and relaxation and a legal entitlement. Splitting holidays themselves down into perhaps UK holidays, perhaps slightly less controversial on the UK holiday front. Obviously, we're quite in control here of what's going to happen, and unless the government starts deciding that you can't go to certain other parts of the UK, then the rules apply across the board. So I don't think that's going to be such an issue. What might be more of an issue is overseas holidays. If people have booked holidays overseas, we saw certainly last summer where countries were continually going on red list or banned list or quarantined. We have the hotels, although I haven't heard about those for a while, but what's going to happen with the quarantine hotels. But it's a possibility that we're going to have a similar thing this summer if foreign holidays do go ahead in August. And so it's how are you perhaps going to manage that, and having the discussion with your staff beforehand about what are your expectations if somebody goes on holiday and then while they're there they find out that they're going to have to quarantine for 2 weeks when they get back or something like that. If they're going to quarantine hotel, it's obviously going to be much harder, but if they're quarantining from home, it's having sort of those expectations and those discussions, you know, in a casual way with staff about what are your expectations. If your staff can work from home, there's in theory no reason that if they decide they go on holiday and they come back and they have to quarantine, that they can't just work from home. If they can't work from home, are you going to have to look at whether you'd have unpaid leave for people who go on holiday? Or, you know, are they going to have to take extra holiday if they want to go on holiday? Holidays are somebody's main expense of the year a lot of the time, and there's a lot of money and goodwill invested in that. So it's really understanding what your expectations are and individuals' expectations are. There was a slight issue possibly about discrimination. I mean, there could be an argument that actually certain people can go on holiday because they've had the vaccine, certain people can't, or possibly even a race issue. You know, if people have from a different country, they want to go back, they always go back on holiday to visit their family abroad, it could be affecting them more than anybody else. So it's a bit of a thorny issue, and I think it's more just talking to your staff about, you know, look, if you're booking a holiday, we're perfectly fine if you want to, if it turns out that you have to quarantine when you get back, we're perfectly fine for you to work from home when you return. Or if you're booking a holiday, you can't work from home when you return, you know that it's not possible. So what are you going to be doing? You know, how are we going to manage that? So it's sort of having those conversations. So talking to your staff, but also possibly having some sort of COVID addendum to you. I don't think you want to change your whole holiday policy to deal with, well, you might want to, but you don't necessarily have to do your whole holiday policy to deal with COVID, because this will hopefully be the last year we have this level of uncertainty maybe. But some sort of addendum you might want to look at about how are you going to deal with these issues that may arise, predominantly around probably quarantine, I would say, if that becomes a necessity. And as we know, it can happen at short notice. So businesses and individuals being aware and owning how are they going to manage that. That's something about holidays. Sickness, and general sickness. I was really interested, not surprised, but interested to see that a Telegraph article recently said that sickness, general sickness, is the lowest it's ever been on record. Part of me is not surprised about that. There's obviously some people that are on furlough who couldn't go into work. And I know from personal experience and speaking to people that actually, when they're working from home, they're less likely to take days off, because actually, if they're feeling slightly under the weather, then actually they can work from home, and you can work from home in your pajamas and a cup of tea. It's a little bit different to getting on a bus or a train and dragging yourself into the office. So the general trend of sickness has actually been quite positive. Turning to specific COVID restrictions, as I think Nikki might have mentioned, if somebody has COVID at work, it is notifiable under health and safety. You've got to make a riddle notification. You've then also got impacts for self-isolation, working from home, sickness entitlement, whether they're entitled to SSP. So you could end up with certain spikes of sickness related to COVID, which obviously we were having when people were going back to the office. So how do you perhaps deal with sickness absences going forward? Today, I think it's the first day that people who are clinically vulnerable, or clinically extremely vulnerable, are no longer required to self-isolate, also to shield. So those people are coming back, required to come back to work. There is the bit about should they still be working from home. Everybody, if they can, should still be working from home. But if they couldn't work from home, what are they now required to come into work? Yes. But you do need to be looking and being mindful about things like discrimination. If they're extremely clinically vulnerable, it's possible, possibly likely, I would say, they may have a disability. And if they've got a disability, then you've got to make reasonable adjustments. So you've got to possibly look at whether you would furlough them as a way of dealing with the immediacy of the situation, whether they take periods of unpaid leave or holidays. So you've got to think about how these people who are suddenly now not now longer required to shield, whether they need to come back into the workplace. So mental health is the other thing I think it's being very mindful of. We have seen an emergence of additional mental health requirements, and that may be something going forward as people has come out of this lockdown and readjusting to the real world. So sickness per se, I think you've got general sickness, which we've all been quite shielded from the outside world, haven't we? And I understand that coughs and colds have almost disappeared. Nobody has any other illnesses or sickness bugs from dodgy restaurants and things like that. So general sickness has been good, as I understand it. So, but it's dealing with those specific COVID-related sicknesses as well. So that's an issue that we thought will come to light. That hasn't necessarily been the case. Like I said, the sickness has actually been a lot better recently. There were two sort of discrete topics that we thought you might find interesting to talk about. We did have a last question, which if anybody wants to, we can talk about. Alternatively, if people have got some questions, happy to look in the chat and see whether anybody wants specific questions answering. If somebody does, do you want to just perhaps pop it in again, just because some of the things we may have asked about, if you just pop a question in the chat that we may not have covered, and we'll see if we can cover it today. We are also, as I think Nikki mentioned, we're looking to hopefully make this a two-part session and do another one in about a month's time, where things may have evolved, but also we can pick up on what we might have done. Are we able to actually ask an employee if they have been vaccinated? I know people are asking if they've been vaccinated. I think you need to think very carefully about, why do you need to know? Because it could be somebody's, it's their person. What are you going to do with it? You've then got that person's data. What are you going to do with it? So I think you need to know. First of all, I would say, why do you need to know? But I know people are being asked, definitely. And I'm being careful about discrimination again, because it could raise issues that haven't been addressed before. So I would be cautious about it, to be honest. And I would think, before you ask the question, think very carefully whether you why you want to know. I do know people that have been asked, but they haven't been required to respond. So if you feel able to respond, you don't have to tell us, but can you tell us? But again, it's thinking, why not? And then what you're going to do with that information when you've got it.
If I can just
Rebecca,
on that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I was just going to say, just obviously applying back to the data protection legislation, you do need to, so I don't know whether you think by just asking a question, that's not the same as having something documented in writing. It's still therefore having the knowledge, and you still have that is still personal data, even if it's a conversation that's been had. So you do need to look at whether there is, what, as Becky said, what is the reasons for asking? It may be that depending on the nature of your business, so care home, you may very well have more of a reason. I say care home, people that are caring in a care home, not an administrator or such. It's going to be an individual case-by-case basis. I'm really sorry, Michaela. It depends on the nature of your business, but you need to make sure that you're looking at the legislation and that you can tick the reasons and the rationale for that. Sorry.
No, that's all right. No, that's fine. No, thanks very much. I agree with you. The second, Joe's question was about could asking those who've been vaccinated back be considered age or disability discrimination, as they're the first group to be vaccinated. There's a bit of what detriment have they suffered? Why would it be negative that they're back to work, unless really it's everybody wants to be at home and they're somehow feeling they're being treated negatively by coming back to work?
About cost, you've got the cost of. I'm just being devil's advocate, Becky. I'm in real pain, but I'm just. If I was an older person, let's say, and I'm being asked to come back, and the youngsters aren't. I've got to pay my travel costs. I've got to get on the train every day or whatever. I've got to travel down.
But you don't have to pay your heating bill. I suppose that's working with the assumption that actually working from home is what everybody wants to be doing, and that is a possibility. And I would say, I think disability discrimination, you need to be thinking about reasonable adjustments as well. If for some reason they don't want to be going back to the office, and there's a real workplace, and there's a real reason as to why not.
I'm just conscious of time. Sorry, Rebecca.
Yeah,
sorry,
no, that's right.
it's 11:01. There's a whole bunch of questions in the chat that I'll circulate round that we can pick up separately, if that's okay. Just purely and simply because I know other people have got other meetings that they need to get to. On that basis, hugely informative. It's a really kind of fluid period in terms of legal precedent and what's going to come out of this and what direction things go in. And again, it's going to be massively dependent on everybody's different case, really, isn't it? When we start to think about it, like you say, care homes are going to be very different to a standard office environment. With that, John, do you have any final thoughts, or Vic, just to wrap up the session?
No, just I think real grateful thanks to Nikki, Becky and Claire for sharing their informed knowledge on this. It's all a bit of a challenge for everybody going forward, and I really like the idea of running the event again in another month's time, because lots of things will have happened. We'll hear obviously some of the other utterances from government about some of these things, so I think it'd be really good to follow it up, because all of us are going carefully step by step and wanting to know and understand how we should deal with some of these issues. And it is a bit of a challenge getting back into the workplace safely and making sure that we follow all the steps we should. So really grateful to all the three of you, and Ollie for chairing. And certainly I'll be talking with you to make sure that we can have a follow-up on this, because I think there's going to be so many continuing questions that people will want to try and find the answers to, and we're really grateful to you and your expertise in helping us, particularly to understand the legal challenges, which from listening seem quite formidable in some of these situations. So thanks a lot, and hopefully see you all soon. And back to Ollie.
Thanks, John. And so all I've really got to say is have a fantastic long Easter weekend if you can. Looks like if you're going to go out and socially distance and meet people, you're going to have to wrap up warm, I'm afraid. But with that, just a quick teaser. So the champion session next Thursday, psychometrics, boon or a bane. So stay tuned for that next week. With that, have a cracking long weekend. We'll circulate the recording, and it'd be great if we could get some answers to some of the questions in the chat. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.